Why am I convinced that generosity has to be the foundation of a generational strategy? And there are actually numerous practical benefits to you and I in generosity. But before we go there, we have to address a profound dilemma. Jesus made it clear that we can't love God and money, that we can't serve God and money, because we will love one and hate the other. So how do we respond? How do we reconcile this? How do we reconcile it without some kind of mental gymnastics to try to justify it? How do we reconcile it with the desire for us and our generations to be blessed and to prosper? Well, I think God gave us a very clear answer. And in Luke, the Pharisees have challenged Jesus on the subject of cleanliness. What's clean? And Jesus responds by saying, you clean the outside of the bowl, you clean the outside of the container, but you don't address what's on the inside. And he instructs them, give what's in the container to the poor, and it will clean the container, it'll make it clean. Or it's said more succinctly in the New Living Translation, purity is demonstrated in generosity. So I will make a bold statement that genuine giving and love of money, bondage to money are mutually exclusive. That when you are genuinely giving, it actually purifies the motives, it purifies the heart. Now, having said that, there is in rare cases, a version of generosity that's manipulative, that it's not about giving it all, but it's about manipulating to receive. But setting that aside, true, pure generosity cleanses our motives and cleanses our hearts. And if for no other reason than that would be our generational strategy. That would be why my boys actually give to God. If for no other reason, if there was no other benefit other than it purified their hearts, purified their motives, that they could be used by God to a greater degree, if for no other reason, it would be worth it just for that. But there are practical benefits and blessings to us in generosity, besides just purifying our heart and our motives. And there are innumerable promises from God that when we bless others, that He blesses us. Now, we won't go through all of them, but I wanted to highlight just a few and understand just where this comes from. God says things like when we give to the poor, we're actually lending to Him and He will repay. Why? Because it's demonstrating God's character. God is a generous, giving God. And so when we're giving, when we're helping others, those who have nothing to offer us, we're mimicking, we're imitating God's very character. God says that when we give, it will come back to us, pressed down, shaken together, and overflowing. Why? Because see, giving is not a money issue. It's a heart issue. It's about demonstrating where our ultimate trust is. That the world pursues money because that's what they place their trust and their confidence in. And God desires to bless us, but He can only bless us when our motives are right. That when our motives are wrong, we actually limit God's blessing. Malachi chapter 3 talks about tithing. Now, I won't get into the debate of whether tithing is a requirement for the New Testament church, but I will say this. I'm an absolute believer in tithing because of the promises that go with it. And I have seen from experience that people who refuse to tithe struggle. They suffer. Why? Because God says in Malachi 3 that when you bring the tithe, the 10% to the storehouse, to the local church, then God has blessings. But if you don't, you're actually robbing from God, that you're actually under a curse, which means God still loves them just as much. But I've seen this repeatedly. Those who struggle with trusting God with their money never really truly live blessed lives. They're completely in bondage. When we are unwilling to trust God with everything, including our money, we limit the blessings that come into our life. And I look at it this way. When I was younger, my younger brother, was actually bigger than me. So when we got into a scuffle, when we got into a bit of a fight, as long as I had the advantage, I was in great shape. But whenever he got the advantage, I always had a backup plan. And I would run to our room, close the door, which had no lock, but I would hold my foot on the floor at the base of the door. which meant when he would push on the door, he could get it open a gap, maybe get his fingers through, but he could never get it open to get in. In the same way, we so often limit God's blessings that He's trying to push those blessings through the tiny gap we have left by our actions. But tithing also has the opposite effect. That God says when we tithe, He actually says, put Him to the test. It's the only place I'm aware of in the Bible where God actually says, the living God, the God of the universe says, put me to the test. See what I will do. If for no other reason than that, let's put Him to the test. And He says, see if I won't pour out such a blessing. You can't contain it all. God's design for you and I is that we would overflow and it would touch and bless others. And He goes on though and He says He will also rebuke the devourer. In other words, He limits the challenges, the problems, the breakdowns, the illnesses, the other issues of life that actually come in and affect us. That there is a degree of protection over our life. Now, one issue is that sometimes it takes a bit of time. That when we begin to give or when we take it to the next level, while we would love to see the immediate impact of those blessings, there are times where there's a season involved. That action is like a seed that has a life in it, and it takes time for that seed to mature. And during that time, our only role is faithfulness, to continue to be faithful. And watch what God will do. And remember, we do have a very real enemy that when you begin to give, there's nothing he would love more than to bring discouragement and get you to give up and miss out on all of God's blessings. And then finally, my challenge to you is to continue to push by faith to a greater degree. What I mean is my boys give 20%. That the 10%, the tithe is literally a minimum standard. That we don't want to live a minimum standard. But that we not only do they give 20%, but the goal, the desire is they would stretch themselves by faith and increase to a greater degree. That they would be a greater blessing, a greater impact on the world around them. Now, I recognize for many people, going to that length may be just beyond where you're at the moment. But start where you are. Make generosity part of your foundation, not just for your generations, but for yourself. Ensure that it is part of the foundation. And wherever you are, the challenge is stretch yourself by faith. Ask God, ask the Holy Spirit, where do I go from here? What's the next step? How do I go further? Years ago, I had a young man working for me that made a profound comment. He said, if you're giving and it doesn't pinch a little bit, are you really giving?